The graveyard was silent, except for the rhythmic panting of Max, the K9 officer, his nose pressed against the old wooden coffin. His handler, Officer Riley Carter, tightened his grip on the leash. The German shepherd had been trained for years to sniff out narcotics, explosives, and even cadavers. But this time was different. Max wasn't just alert, he was terrified. His body stiffened, his ears flattened, and a deep growl rumbled in his throat. The other officers exchanged glances. A dog like Max didn't scare easily. Riley. "What the hell is going on?" Officer Daniels muttered, shifting uneasily. The entire team had been called to this gravesite after an anonymous tip suggested something wasn't right with the burial. Max let out a sudden bark, sharp, urgent. His claws scraped against the wood. He wasn't just alerting them. He was trying to dig. Something was inside. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. "All right," Captain Morris sighed, rubbing his temples. "Get the damn thing open." The team hesitated. Opening a sealed coffin in the middle of the night felt like something out of a horror movie. But they had orders. 2 officers stepped forward, crowbars in hand, and jammed the metal into the edges of the casket. The wood groaned in protest. As the screws loosened, Riley steadied Max, his own pulse hammering in his ears. He'd worked with the dog for 6 years, trusted him more than anyone. If Max was reacting like this, then whatever was inside wasn't just a body. With one final heave, the lid popped open, and the stench hit them first. A wave of decay, thick and putrid, rolled over the officers. Even those who had seen the worst of crime scenes gagged and turned away. But Riley didn't move. His eyes were locked on the body inside. At first glance, it looked like a typical corpse. Male, mid-40s, dressed in a black suit. Hands folded over his chest. Peaceful. Too peaceful. "Jesus," Daniels whispered. "They buried him yesterday. How does he already look like that?" Riley took a step closer, shining his flashlight over the man's face. That's when he saw it. The man's lips were slightly parted, and wedged between his teeth was a piece of fabric, a torn scrap of cloth, stained with blood. A chill skittered down Riley's spine. This wasn't right. This wasn't a normal death. He crouched closer, gripping the fabric with gloved fingers and slowly pulling it free. Then he heard it. A whisper. Soft, ragged, coming from inside the coffin. Riley's breath caught in his throat. His flashlight wobbled in his grasp. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. The officers stared at him, confusion flickering in their eyes. "Hear what?" Daniels asked. Riley's pulse pounded. That voice. Someone just whispered. Max let out a sharp whimper, his tail tucking between his legs. He backed away, his fur bristling. Riley had never seen the dog react like this before. "Carter," Captain Morris said sternly. "There's no one in that coffin except a dead man." Riley's gaze snapped back to the corpse. He forced himself to look at the man's lips again. His own breath came out in short, rapid bursts, and then he saw it. The lips had moved. It was slight, barely noticeable. But they had moved. Riley shot backward, nearly tripping over Max. The dog barked furiously now, his fear turning to aggression. And then, without warning, the corpse gasped, a wheezing, choking, rattling breath, and his hand, his cold, stiff hand, shot up and grabbed Riley's wrist. Riley screamed. Officers stumbled back, weapons raised. But before anyone could react, before Riley could tear himself away from the corpse's deathly grip, the man's eyes snapped open, bloodshot, unfocused, desperate. And he spoke. "They buried me alive." Riley Carter had seen death in every form. As a K9 officer for nearly a decade, he had worked homicide scenes, drug busts, and search and rescue missions. He had witnessed bodies broken beyond recognition, people who had taken their last breaths in the worst ways imaginable. But never had he seen anything like this. His heart was still hammering in his chest as he stumbled backward away from the coffin. Away from the corpse that had just spoken. No, not a corpse, a man, buried alive. Max whined at his side, ears pinned flat against his skull. The German shepherd, his most trusted partner, was still fixated on the coffin, his muscles tense, every instinct screaming at him that something was wrong. Riley tried to steady his breathing, but his mind was already racing. This wasn't just a case. This was personal. Because buried deep in his past, hidden beneath years of discipline, routine, and the uniform he wore like armor, was a truth he never spoke about. His father had been buried alive. It had been a cold winter night, 25 years ago. Riley had been 8 years old, sitting by the window waiting for his father to come home from his shift as a private security guard. But he never did. 3 days later, they found him. The police ruled it an accident, a robbery gone wrong. His father had been forced into the trunk of his own car and left for dead in an abandoned field. By the time they found him, his nails had been torn down to the bone from scratching at the inside of the trunk. His throat was raw. He had screamed until his last breath. Riley never forgot that detail. He had nightmares about it, about his father's hands, the way his fingers had been shredded, his knuckles cracked from trying to claw his way out, and now standing here staring at this man, this not dead man, something inside him cracked. This should have been impossible. The officers were still frozen in shock. Captain Morris was barking orders into his radio, calling for medics, calling for backup. Daniels stood pale-faced, his gun still drawn as if expecting the man in the coffin to do something even worse. But Riley wasn't listening. His gaze was locked onto the man's eyes. Bloodshot, wild, desperate, and familiar. There was something about his face, something Riley couldn't place. A deep sense of déjà vu, like a memory clawing its way back from the darkness. Who was this man? And more importantly, who wanted him buried alive? A gust of wind howled through the cemetery, rustling the branches of the gnarled oak trees overhead. Max let out a low, uneasy growl. Riley reached down, gripping the dog's harness, grounding himself. He had a sick feeling in his gut. This wasn't just some random crime. This was a message, and Riley was starting to think it was meant for him, the man in the coffin. The cemetery was silent except for the frantic gasps of the man they had just pulled from the coffin. His breath came in ragged, desperate gulps, as if his body still didn't believe he was free. He was covered in dirt, his fingernails cracked and bleeding from clawing at the wooden lid. Riley crouched beside him, his heart still hammering in his chest. "Who did this to you?" The man's bloodshot eyes flickered toward Riley. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. His lips barely moved, forming just one word: "Run!" Riley felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Run from what?" he demanded. But the man's eyelids fluttered, his body going limp. Max whined, nudging Riley's arm. The German shepherd was still on edge, his ears twitching, his body tense. He was trained to detect human emotions, fear, rage, pain. And right now Max was picking up something wrong. Riley looked around. The other officers were still standing in shock, whispering among themselves. Captain Morris had stepped away, still on his radio, trying to get medics to the scene, but something wasn't right. A man had just been found buried alive, yet there were no signs of a struggle nearby, no footprints in the damp soil, no disturbed earth except for the grave itself. Whoever had done this was careful, too careful. Riley turned back to the coffin. The inside was scratched and bloodied, but something else caught his eye. There, etched into the wood near where the man's head had been, were 4 letters, B039, a code, or a warning, a whisper from the past. By the time the paramedics arrived, the man was barely conscious. They loaded him onto a stretcher, securing an oxygen mask over his face. Riley followed, keeping pace with the stretcher. He needed to know who this man was, why he had been left to die. Just as they were about to load him into the ambulance, the man's hand shot out, gripping Riley's wrist with surprising strength. His nails dug into Riley's skin, and for a split second Riley swore he saw something in his eyes, recognition. With the last bit of energy he had, the man rasped, "Not the first." Then he passed out. Not the first. Riley's pulse quickened. He pulled out his phone and quickly searched for missing persons cases in the area. His gut was telling him something, and he had learned a long time ago to trust it. As the screen loaded, his breath caught in his throat. 3 other men had disappeared. Over the last 6 months, All under mysterious circumstances, all never found the connection. No one saw back at the precinct. Riley sat at his desk, staring at the case files spread before him. He had pulled up everything he could find on the missing men. They had no obvious connections, different ages, different professions. One was a businessman, another a construction worker, the third a retired school teacher. But something was nagging at him. Max sat by his feet, tail thumping against the ground. Every now and then, the dog's head would lift as if sensing his handler's frustration. Then Riley saw it, a single detail buried in one of the reports. All 3 men had been found with traces of formaldehyde in their systems before their disappearances. The same chemical used to preserve the dead. A chill crept down Riley's spine. These men weren't just victims. Someone had been preparing them for burial. The coffin maker's secret. The next day, Riley and Max drove to the local funeral home, the only one in the county that still made custom wooden coffins. The name on the workshop door was Harrison & Sons Funeral Services. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust and varnish. An elderly man stood at a workbench, carving delicate patterns into a coffin lid. His gnarled hands worked with precision, his face expressionless. Riley flashed his badge. "Officer Carter, I need to ask you a few questions." The old man didn't look up. "About what?" Riley pulled up a photo of the coffin from last night. "Do you recognize this work?" The man's hands froze. Riley didn't miss the way his fingers trembled slightly as he set down his carving knife. "I make a lot of coffins," the man said finally. "Can't say I remember everyone." Riley took a step closer. This one had a man inside it, alive. The man's jaw tightened. A flicker of something, fear, passed through his eyes. Max suddenly let out a low growl. The old man glanced at the dog, then back at Riley. He sighed, wiping his hands on his apron. "You should leave this alone, officer." Riley stiffened. "Why?" The old man hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Because the people who ordered that coffin, they weren't planning on burying just one man." A trap. It set Riley's blood turned ice cold. The old man reached for something under the table. Instinct kicked in. Riley grabbed his gun, but before he could draw it, the man slid a folded piece of paper across the workbench. Riley took it, unfolding it carefully. Inside were 3 words written in shaky handwriting, B039, the same code from the coffin. His pulse pounded in his ears. "What does this mean?" The old man just shook his head. "I don't know, but they come back every time the number changes, and when they do, someone else disappears." Riley exchanged a glance with Max. The dog's ears were pinned back, his body tense. Another victim was already chosen, and they were running out of time. A lead that felt too easy. Riley sat in his car outside the funeral home, staring at the paper. With the code B039, Max sat beside him, ears perked, eyes alert. The German Shepherd had been trained to recognize stress in his handler, and right now Riley was feeling it. Whoever was behind this had been planning these burials with precision. But what bothered Riley the most was the funeral directors. Warning, they come back every time the number changes. What did that mean? Riley plugged the code into his laptop, running it through every police database he had access to. Nothing. No matches. No addresses. No records. Then, on a hunch, he typed it into an old mortuary records database. A single hit, plot B039, a burial site in an abandoned graveyard just outside of town. Riley's breath caught. Was this where the next victim was being held? A race against time, Riley radioed Captain Morris, briefing him on the lead. A backup unit was on the way, but Riley wasn't about to sit and wait. He hit the gas, speeding toward the graveyard. The road was dark, the trees lining the path casting eerie shadows in the headlights. Max let out a low whine from the passenger seat. "We're close, buddy," Riley muttered. As he pulled up to the overgrown cemetery, he could feel it, the suffocating weight of something wrong. The air was too still, no wind, no sounds of night creatures, just an unnatural silence. Riley grabbed his flashlight and his gun, stepping out of the car. Max followed closely, his body tense. They moved carefully through the graveyard, weaving through crooked tombstones until they reached plot B039. Riley's stomach clenched. The dirt was fresh. A grave had just been dug. A wooden coffin sat halfway inside, its lid open. Someone was inside. The trap snaps. Shut. Riley rushed forward, his heart pounding. He gripped the edge of the coffin and shone his flashlight inside. A man lay motionless, his skin pale, lips slightly parted. "Hey!" Riley shook his shoulder. No response. The man wasn't moving, but something felt off. Then Riley noticed it, the lack of claw marks on the inside of the coffin, the absence of panic. Unlike the last victim, this man hadn't fought to escape. Because he hadn't been buried alive, he had been placed here, as bait. A snap echoed behind him. Riley spun around, gun raised. But it was too late. A sharp pain exploded at the back of his head. The world tilted. And then, darkness. Buried, alive, a groggy haze settled over Riley's mind. His head throbbed. His limbs felt heavy. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the graveyard. He was in a coffin, the wooden walls pressed in around him. The air was stale. His arms were pinned at his sides. Panic surged. No, 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 no. He tried to move, but the lid was shut tight. The darkness was absolute. Then, through the silence, he heard a familiar sound, scratching from above. Max. Riley gasped in relief. The dog had followed his scent, but how much time did he have? He banged, his fist against the lid. "Max, dig, boy! Dig!" Scratching turned to frantic digging. Dirt rained down. Riley's breath was coming in short gasps now, the oxygen running out, the edges of his vision blurred. Then a sliver of light, then more, then air. Max's paws tore through the last layer of dirt, and Riley sucked in a deep breath. With the last of his strength he pushed, and the coffin lid cracked open. He was alive. But this wasn't over. Whoever had buried him was still out there, and they were watching. The weight of failure. Riley sat on the cold ground, his body covered in dirt, his breaths uneven. He had just escaped death again. But the victory felt hollow. The graveyard was empty. Whoever had buried him had vanished without a trace. Max sat beside him, ears flat, sensing his handler's distress. The German shepherd nudged Riley's arm with his nose, but Riley barely reacted. His mind was replaying the last few hours in loops. He had been so close. The lead was solid. The coffin, the body, the code. It had all made sense. And yet he had walked right into a trap. Riley had prided himself on being steps ahead of criminals, on anticipating their next move. But tonight, he had been played, and someone out there, the one behind all of this, was laughing at him. A call that changes everything. The radio on his vest crackled. "Riley, come in." His hand trembled as he reached for it. "Go ahead, Captain." Morris's voice came through, grim and tense. "We have a problem." Riley's pulse quickened. "What kind of problem?" A brief pause. Then, "The man from the coffin? The one you found? He's not dead." Riley jerked upright. "What?" "He just woke up in the morgue." A living corpse, sir. Riley sped back to the station, Max in the passenger seat, silent and alert. Everything about this case had been a nightmare, but this was impossible. If the man had been alive the entire time, why had he looked so lifeless? How had he survived being buried? Or worse, had he even been buried at all? By the time Riley reached the precinct, his hands were shaking. He stormed through the hallways, his boots echoing off the walls. The morgue was at the end of the hall, sterile and silent. When he pushed, the doors open. He expected chaos. Officers, medical examiners, a flurry of activity. Instead, he found nothing. The room was empty, and the slab where the body had been, vacant. His heart slammed against his ribs. Then he saw it, a single note placed where the body had been, with 5 chilling words written in red ink. "You were never meant to live. A killer who knows everything." Riley clenched the paper in his hands, his breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just a near-death experience. This was a message. Whoever had orchestrated this had known exactly how Riley would react. They had led him to the graveyard, They had set the trap, and now they were inside the precinct right under their noses. Max growled, low and warning. The German shepherd's body tensed, his eyes locked on the security camera in the corner of the room. Riley followed his gaze, and that's when he saw it, the small red light blinking. The camera wasn't just recording. Someone was watching. Right. Now, and they wanted him to know it. A hunter becomes the hunted. Riley's heart pounded as he locked eyes with the blinking red light on the security camera. His entire body was rigid with the realization someone was watching him. Not just watching, controlling the game. The body in the coffin had vanished. The man who was supposed to be dead had left behind a chilling note, and now Riley was standing alone in the morgue, trapped in a silent war with an unseen enemy. Max let out a low, guttural growl, his ears pinned back. The dog sensed it before Riley did. They weren't alone. Riley's fingers hovered over his gun. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. Every instinct screamed at him to move. Then, the morgue's overhead lights flickered, once, twice, and then with a sharp pop they died, plunging the room into darkness. Riley didn't wait. He dropped to a crouch, his back against the metal slab. Max pressed against his leg, silent but ready. The only sound was the faint hum of electricity struggling to return. Then, in the pitch-black silence, a whisper, right behind him. "You're running out of time, Detective." Face to face with a ghost, Riley spun, gun drawn, but there was no one there. The door to the morgue creaked open slightly, a sliver of light cutting through the darkness. His pulse was a hammer in his chest. Whoever had whispered those words was already gone. Riley exhaled sharply, pushing himself up. His mind raced, searching for an explanation. He had seen countless criminals crack under pressure, had faced murderers who thought they were untouchable. But this was something else. His radio crackled again. "Detective?" Captain Morris's voice came through, tense. "You need to get out of there now." Riley grabbed the radio. "Tell me what's happening." "You were right. This whole thing was a setup. The body, he was never supposed to stay dead." A cold sensation crawled down Riley's spine. "What do you mean?" Captain Morris hesitated. "That man in the coffin, he's not just some victim. He's a ghost from your past." Riley's stomach twisted. "His name is Daniel Graves." Riley went rigid. No, it couldn't be. Daniel Graves, a name that should have remained buried 6 years. A name that should have stayed dead. The case that never died. 6 years ago, Riley had led an investigation into a high-profile serial killer. The man had left cryptic messages carved into his victims' bodies, always one step ahead of the police. The case had consumed Riley's life, pulling him into an abyss of sleepless nights and desperate leads. And then, one night, it had ended. Or so he had thought. They had caught their suspect, Daniel Graves, a former surgeon turned killer whose mind was as twisted as his crimes. Riley had seen him die, had watched the light fade from his eyes after a fatal gunshot. So how in the hell was he alive now? Unless Riley had killed the wrong man, the perfect illusion, the note, the missing body, the whisper in the dark. It all made sense now. Daniel Graves had never died. He had orchestrated his own death, faked his demise, and disappeared into the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return, and now he had lured Riley straight into his trap. Max let out a sharp bark, snapping Riley back to reality. He had to move. If Graves was alive, that meant one thing. He wasn't done playing. Riley turned to leave the morgue, but the moment he reached for the door handle, his phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. Riley hesitated, then swiped the screen. 1. Image loaded. A live feed from inside his apartment. His blood turned to ice. The photo showed his sister, Emily, tied to a chair. A timer below it counted down. 01:59. 01:58. 01:57. Riley didn't breathe. Then another message appeared. "Time's up, Detective. You took something from me. Now, I take something from you." Daniel Graves wasn't just back. He had made this personal. The final showdown, Riley's. Car screeched to a stop outside his apartment. He was out of the vehicle before the engine had fully died. Gun drawn. Max leaped out beside him, barking furiously. The apartment door was slightly ajar. Riley moved with practiced precision, sweeping the room. Every instinct told him to slow down, to think, but he couldn't. Not when Emily was in danger. The living room was empty. No signs of a struggle. Then, a soft creak from the bedroom. Riley moved, his body tense, his finger hovering over the trigger. He shoved the door open and stopped cold. Emily was there, tied to a chair, gagged, her eyes wide with terror, and behind her a man stood in the shadows, calm, smiling, Daniel Graves, alive, very much alive. "Hello, Detective," Graves murmured, stepping forward. "Miss me?" The final decision. Riley's grip on his gun tightened. "Let her go," Graves chuckled. Now, we both know it's not that simple." Emily whimpered, struggling against the ropes. Graves reached into his coat and pulled out a scalpel, a chilling reminder of his past. "You put me in the grave once, Riley," Graves said, tilting his head. "It only seems fair that I return the favor." Riley's vision blurred with rage. He could shoot, end this now, but Graves knew that. He was waiting for Riley to make the first move. A trap. Every part of this was a trap. Then Max growled. The German shepherd crouched low, ready to strike. Graves smiled. Ah, the dog. Always so loyal. And then he lunged. In a blur, everything happened at once. Graves moved toward Emily. Max leaped. Riley fired. The gunshot roared through the room. Graves staggered back. Blood spread across his shirt. He collapsed to the floor, eyes wide. Max stood over him, teeth bared. Riley rushed to Emily, cutting her free. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing. The nightmare was over, or so he thought, because as he turned back to Graves's body, the man let out a weak, chilling laugh and whispered, "This isn't over." Then he stopped breathing. The last twist hours later, as Riley stood outside, the night air crisp against his skin, Captain Morris approached. "It's done," she said. Riley didn't answer, because something felt wrong. Graves had planned everything, every detail, so why had he gone down so easily? His phone buzzed, another unknown message, with only 2 words. "See you soon." Riley's stomach dropped. Max let out a low growl. Somewhere in the darkness, a predator still lurked, and Riley knew this game was far from over. The vanishing body Riley stood over Daniel Graves's lifeless body, his mind still racing. The forensic team moved around him, securing the scene. It was over, or so he wanted to believe. Captain Morris patted his shoulder. "You did good, Riley. Let's get you some rest." Riley nodded, but as he turned to leave, Max let out a low, uneasy growl. The German shepherd stood frozen, staring at Graves's corpse. Riley's stomach twisted. Max had never growled at a dead man before. Then, one of the forensic officers let out a sharp gasp. "Captain, something's wrong." Riley turned back. His pulse hammered. The body, Graves' body, was gone. A message from the grave chaos erupted. Officers shouted, searching the apartment, but Riley already knew the truth. Graves had planned this. Even in death, he had one last move left. Riley's phone buzzed. A new message from Daniel Graves. His hands trembled as he opened it. One image loaded, a live feed from inside a dimly lit morgue, a coffin, and a single line of text beneath it. "You buried the wrong man." Riley's blood ran cold. Then, Max barked. Somewhere outside, in the deep, dark city, a shadow was watching, waiting, and Riley knew this nightmare was just beginning. The coffin that shouldn't exist. The air inside the precinct was thick with tension. Officers murmured, forensic experts scrambled, and Captain Morris barked orders. But Riley, he was frozen, staring at the message on his phone. "You buried the wrong man." The live feed from the morgue flickered. A single coffin sat in the cold storage room. It was the same coffin that had been sealed hours ago. Riley clenched his fists, his mind racing. Graves was dead. He saw him die. He saw his body in the apartment. So how was he sending messages? A hand gripped his shoulder. It was Captain Morris. His face was pale. We need to check that coffin, now, Max growled low. He could sense it. Something wasn't right. The morgue. A chilling discovery. The drive to the morgue was silent, except for the faint tapping of Riley's fingers against the steering wheel. Max sat in the back seat, eyes locked on the road. Ahead, his body tense like he was expecting something to happen. As soon as they arrived, a security guard rushed to meet them. "The cameras, they glitched," he stammered, "for about 3 minutes, and when they came back, his voice trailed off." Riley pushed past him, moving fast. The cold storage room was eerily quiet, the dim fluorescent lights flickering. And there, it was the coffin, exactly where it had been placed, except now, the lid was slightly open. Riley's breath hitched. Captain Morris exchanged a glance with him, then nodded. Together they stepped forward. Riley's hands trembled as he reached for the lid and pushed it open. Inside nothing, the coffin was completely empty. A chill ran down Riley's spine. Max let out a sharp bark, backing up, his hackles raised. Captain Morris cursed under his breath. "What the hell is going on?" A message from beyond a sudden vibration in Riley's pocket made his heart skip. His phone, another message from Daniel Graves. Riley swallowed hard and opened it. Checked the walls, his pulse hammered. "What?" Max barked wildly, scratching at the far wall of the storage room. Riley turned, his breath catching as he saw something he should have noticed earlier. The thin red streaks running down the tiles. Blood, slowly, painfully. Riley reached forward and pushed against the wall. It moved. A secret door, a passageway leading somewhere deep below the morgue. Max snarled, the fur along his back standing up like needles. Captain Morris pulled out his gun. "We're going in." Riley took a deep breath. He had no choice. If Graves was still alive, or if something worse was waiting, he was about to find out. The truth beneath the city. The hidden corridor was damp and smelled of decay. The walls were lined with old rusted pipes dripping water onto the cracked cement floor. Riley moved carefully, his gun raised. Max stayed close, sniffing aggressively. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Then Max froze. His ears perked. A sound, a faint scraping noise just ahead. Riley held his breath as they reached a small, rusted door. He placed his ear against it. Thump a heartbeat. Someone was alive in there. Captain Morris looked at Riley. "Ready?" Riley nodded, then kicked the door open. Inside, a man chained to a chair, unconscious. Riley's breath caught in his throat, because the man sitting in that chair, beaten and barely breathing, was Daniel Graves. Who was in the coffin? Riley's world tilted. How was this possible? They had buried Graves, they had seen him dead, so who had they buried? His phone buzzed again. Another message, from the same number. The real game begins now. A photo followed. A grainy, black and white image of a man wearing a mask identical to Graves's face. Riley's stomach churned. Someone had been pretending to be Graves. Someone had taken his identity, died in his place, and led them all into this nightmare. But why, and more importantly, who was pulling the strings? Final message. The hunt is not. Over Daniel Graves stirred, groaning in pain. His lips moved, barely above a whisper. Riley leaned in close, his heart pounding. Who did this? Graves's eyelids fluttered open, his pupils dilated with fear. His lips trembled as he finally spoke. "You don't understand, they're already inside." The overhead lights flickered. Max growled. A shadow moved in the corridor behind them. Riley spun around, gun raised, but the figure was already gone. A whisper echoed through the tunnels. "See you soon, detective," and just like that, the game was back on.